Brilliant.
There we go.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, and welcome to another webinar from the Water Loss Specialist Group. Today, we're very lucky to have Stuart Mawditt, who's been doing lots of pioneering work, looking at consumption and looking how it affects DMAs and how it affects us trying to find leakage and non-revenue water in DMAs. So, Stuart, we'll hand over to you. If you could introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours for the next 45 minutes. Then we'll have Q&As at the end. If you've got a question, please put it in the chat, put it to everybody so we can all see the question. And then we'll have about 10-15 minutes at the end of Stuart's presentation to ask him some questions. So over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Michael. So my name is Stuart Mawditt. I'm Managing Director at Anglian Water. I've been in the UK water industry for over 15 years now. And as an organisation, Anglian Water, we are relatively new. We've been around 5 years, and we specialise in analysing flow and pressure and acoustic data, and really with the DMA focus. So anything to do with leakage, pressure data, understanding customer flows, understanding leak flows in DMA, that's our kind of area of specialisation. And today we're going to be talking predominantly about Paradigm, which is a club project that we've been working with the UK water industry for the past 3 years to develop understanding of customer demand and use that understanding to separate out leakage from customer demand and data issues in DMA. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the natural rate of rise of the data gremlins, which people will probably be familiar with the idea of natural rate of rise of leakage, the idea that we have a continuous increase in leakage and new leaks breaking out in areas. But we also seem to have data problems as well. So as analysts, we need to be managing both in kind of tandem. We'll talk about Paradigm, so the club project that we've been working on, and how we've been using that to build and validate demand, and then using that information to understand what could be right or what could be wrong with our areas. I've got some case studies to run through. So from the water companies we've been working with, DMAs that we've analysed with them and what they've looked like and what they told us about the DMA and the steps they took then to investigate and resolve things. And a lot of those they're relatively simple problems. So they're problems that probably if your part of your role is looking at leakage and looking at operability problems in DMAs, they're probably areas that you're fairly familiar with and won't come as a surprise. But we'll be looking at how understanding what the expected behaviour of a DMA should be can help us to find those issues faster and get to the root cause. So first of all, I want to talk about the natural rate of rise of the data gremlin. So I've got a graph here with data uncertainty going up the side and time across the bottom. And what we tend to find with DMAs is that over time, problems occur within our DMAs. So as we go along, we might have a small problem occur. A logger might fail, for example. Somebody goes out and replaces that logger. Maybe they don't get it quite right. And a common problem we have in the UK is time offset. So we're in British summertime at the moment, even though it's nearly finished. It's at the end of October, and it certainly is finished outside looking out the window. But people might go and replace the logger, and we might get the time set wrong on it. So actually that data's out by an hour. When we look at our leakage calculations, it doesn't make much difference. So we might ignore that. We might let that slide and move along with that. As we go along, we might then have another problem. We might have a burst in an area. Somebody might go out and repair that burst. They might rezone the area as part of that repair. And they might not quite get the rezone right. Maybe they close the wrong valve, or maybe they leave a valve partially open or fully open. So we've got a bit more uncertainty around what's happening in our DMAs. And these problems start to compound. And then we might have another problem. One of our meters might start to fail in the DMA, for example. It might start under-recorded. The problem is that because we've already got other problems with our DMAs, these problems then build up, and it gets harder for an analyst to see what's happening with the area and see that you've got a new problem because it just gets hidden once it goes on. What typically happens is we reach a point where we say, oh, this isn't very good, and water companies do a project. So they'll send somebody in and say, well, I've got these DMAs, they're not operable, they're not working, I need meters replacing, I need to do this, and this. They'll spend quite a bit of money on it over a period of 6 months. They might go and do kind of a proper project. And then people walk away from it. And of course, in the background, it starts to build up again. So part of the challenge here is to say, how do we keep on top of these issues? How do we spot them quickly and effectively in the same way that we would expect to spot a change in leakage? And how do we make sure we've got processes in place to respond to? And there's lots of things that could be happening. So some examples there of data gremlins that might happen. Boundary integrity, so partially bypass meters, for example, or open boundary valves on a DMA. There might be meter and signal configuration issues. So we might have an area set up properly, but it might be missing an outlet meter in our corporate system. So whilst it's working well on the network, our schematics and our understanding of it might not be right. Common problem with bidirectional meters, we might be missing a signal, or we might have the flows the wrong way around for them, particularly where we've got complex areas with lots of storage and water moving through the areas. We might have asset failure, so DMA meters might start to under and over report, particularly in areas where we've had DMAs established for a long time. We might have meters that have been in the ground for tens of years, as opposed to areas where we've got new DMAs going in, the meters have only been 3 or 4 years. And often one of the key problems is customer demand, and we've got an example that looks at that a little bit later in the presentation. But there's lots of things that could go wrong with customer meters. The meter itself could fail, the meter could be partially bypassed, customers could be assigned to the wrong DMA, there could be additional meters or connections for those customers. There's all kinds of things that could go wrong. So why is that important to summarise? With lots of areas to manage, analysts often miss gradual changes in their area. So there might be small things going wrong. It's a lot to keep on top of, and that can make it harder to find leakage in the long term. Another challenge we see is that if you're a new analyst coming into role, you generally accept that the current profile for a DMA is typical of what the area could be and should be. And that means that anomalies like missing meters out of our assignment, or valves that should be closed that are open, often go unmissed for long periods of time because it becomes the new norm. It becomes the accepted behaviour of that DMA. That valve being open means the DMA gets a bit more pressure, and that means that that's pressure we don't accept for that area. However, finding and tackling problems quickly is the most effective way of resolving them in the most efficient way. In the examples we talked about at the start, where we might have a problem with a time offset on a logger, if we know the technician who was out there doing it and we spot it quickly, we can say, well, you can go and fix it, and they know where the logger is. They've got the software on their computer. They can go and get it all set up and done, and it's more effective. Similarly, if we've done a burst repair and we've left the valve open by mistake, we can speak to the network team who did the burst repair and say, well, which valves did you operate? Are you sure that you closed them all? Can we go and check? And they can just go back to those valves, as opposed to waiting 6 months, realizing we've got a problem, and then we have to go back and check every valve in the area to try and understand what the problem is. There's also an opportunity there with improving culture. So where you are spotting mistakes quickly as a leakage team and start to say to the network team, well, something's not right there, it helps to encourage people to do their job properly in the first place, to put it bluntly. So if you can pick up on mistakes quickly and go back to those relevant teams, then they then know that their work is being audited and being checked, and they know that they need to be thorough and do things right in the first place. So it makes your job as a leakage team significantly easier, because you're not then having to babysit and check other people's problems and understand and do those investigations yourself. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Paradigm and the flood project. So 3-4 years ago, we started developing Paradigm. We did some work with United Utilities, and then we did a project with Severn Trent that was very spreadsheet based. So we were putting data into spreadsheets and analysing. And we realised that this wasn't very scalable. And then at the time we did a project, there was 300 DMAs. Severn Trent has about 3,000. So you can imagine if we did that for 300 DMAs, which took a couple of months, then by the time we'd gone around the whole of the DMA patch, we'd be 18 months later. And we'd then be exactly to the same position that I was showing earlier, we'd then be going back to the start and starting again on the DMAs that new problems had started to emerge in. So what we said to the water companies was, we want to create an automated process. How can we take your data into the system on a weekly basis, process it through, and say whether there's any new data anomalies occurring? So that gives us the opportunity to start working through the backlog of things that maybe have gone wrong in the past, but also quickly pick up on new stuff that occurs. Originally, the project was set up with United Utilities, who are in the top left of the diagram there, South and Severn Trent in the middle, and Anglian on the right. And then, so that started 2 years ago. And then last year, Yorkshire Water, who are the water company and the sort of the northeasterly water company there, and Thames Water, based there around London, came on board. And then 6 months ago, South West Water also joined us. So we've now got a group of companies that cover 70% of England in terms of the properties that they serve, all feeding in their ideas and concepts. In terms of what we aim to do as a project, the key thing is separating leakage from what's customer demand and data anomalies. So how do we understand what's leakage and what's not? And then we do the basics well. So we're not telling water companies how to go and find leakage. They're already good at doing that. What we're trying to do is to say, well, there's where you should send your best leakage people. These are the areas where it's definitely a leakage problem. And these are the areas where actually, you know what, it could be a data problem, or it could be a problem with the network. Let's do some checks before we send in our leakage teams. We've been aiming to improve understanding across the industry. So part of the project aim is to build up that knowledge bank. So how do we make sure that we're taking those learnings and we're putting them in a place where the industry can learn for the future and making sure that knowledge is available? And then looking to track improvement over time. So how can we show that as an industry, we're moving forward and we're improving the areas that we've got? How can we make sure that we're starting to reduce the number of data anomalies we have, but also making sure that emerging ones are handled quickly? What Paradigm is not is a fancy AI tool that will solve all the problems. So I think one of our key taglines is this idea of doing the basics well and doing the right solution in the right place. And that really is about putting good resources, whether they're analyst resources or field resources in the water companies, into the best place where they can do their job. So making sure they know this is an area with a leakage problem, let's go in there, but relying on the analysts to do that analysis and take responsibility for that. Okay, so what does it look like? So here we've got a net flow for a DMA. We build up some allowances for what we think might be happening in there. We've got a kind of a standard background leakage formula in there. We then apply a household consumption. So we put a shape in for what we think household consumption should be. We use census data in the UK to identify characteristics of properties, so the property size, the occupancy, how affluent the properties are, lots of factors like that. So we've got a number of categories and a number of demand factors which are applied. We then apply non-household consumption over the top in the same way, and we've got continuously logged users. So when we talk about continuously logged users in Paradigm, they tend to be our larger industrial users where we've permanently put a logger on them. And they're effectively treated as an outlet from the DMA, but we include them in our demand calculation. What we're left with is our unaccounted for water. And we don't know what this is. This could be leakage, it could be demand, it could indicate that there's a problem with our monitoring of the area or the integrity of the boundary. If we look at the shape of that profile, and that's what Paradigm really comes down to, is understanding the shapes, we can see that's not a flat continuous profile. So that would suggest to me that it's not a leakage problem. So it could be a demand problem. It could be that actually we've got more demand in that area than we think we have. So we might be missing some properties from our calculation, or we might have a user that's using more water than we think they are. Or it might indicate that there's a problem with our understanding of the area. So actually the boundary might be in a different place. So let's look at another example of an area. So in this case, we can see we've got an allowance in there of about 300 litres per day per household. And we've got unaccounted for water, which is sitting around 12 litres per second. So quite a good chunk of unaccounted for water average across the day. You can see at night time, there's sort of almost 5 litres per second of night flow. And this is an area that one of our clients, DMAs, and an area that the leakage managers in that area was consistently told by his supervisor, you need to get in there and find leakage. And he said, well, we don't think it's leakage, we think it's demand, but without any evidence to prove it, he was constantly under pressure to explain why there was leakage in that area. So if we drop down that unaccounted for water shape, then we can see actually it closely matches the household shape and volumes that we've got in this area. So if we then say, well, let's adjust the household consumption. So if we said 600 litres per day per household in this area, then that actually gives us a much better fit for that DMA. And we can see there that there's no leakage in that area. So this is some of the initial work that we did looking at DMAs. And that helps us to understand how important the occupancy and other factors coming from the census data are to the analysis. So this is a central Birmingham area, which has a very high occupancy. So actually the 600 litres per day is perfectly fair for that DMA and gives us confidence there isn't leakage in there. What we've gone on to do with this is to create the idea of a rating system. So effectively, DMAs get a star rating out of 5, which tells us how good the model is for them. Where we've got a 5, we're saying the model's a really good match. Where it's not a 5, it's lower down, there might be a problem with understanding. And then the challenge for the project is then to say, well, is it not a 5-star because the model's not good enough? Are there areas we can improve the model? Or is there something wrong with the area, something wrong with our understanding or the flow into the area? So an example of a 5-star DMA would look like this. And typically the 3 things we're looking at is the range of the profile. So you can see when we look at the y-axis, the range of the profile there goes from about 7 up to about 27 for the model profile, and the net flow is a little bit bigger. But typically they've got the same range, and with the orange there being our model profile, the blue being the net. 4-star is where we think the model shape and range match, but the flow sits consistently high. So you can see in this case, the profiles are very similar, but the net flow is sitting higher. And these examples where we say, we think there's leakage in that area, we think there's a leakage problem. And 4 stars typically tell us that historically, we've never managed to get down to the model. Moving down, 2 and 3 stars are where the shape's correct, but the range is wrong. So you can see in this example, we've got a reasonably close shape, but the model profile's got a bigger range. So you can see it sits longer on the y-axis, which tells us that something's not quite right in this area. We haven't got as much flow going in as the model thinks there should be. So in this DMA example, there's not enough flow going in. In this opposite example, you can see, which is the upstream DMA, there's too much water going to this DMA, which then means that it sits above the model profile. And what we found here was actually there was a problem with the meter, which was on the boundary. So actually the valve that was adjacent to the meter was partially opened. And when we merge these areas together and look at them in tandem, we can see that actually they give a very good fit. So we can start to use this to understand what the problems might be on the network. Another example here where you've got the meter dropping out at night. So you can see that actually the flows are going too low to this area. If we didn't have this, we'd be maybe reporting a negative leakage in this area, and we'd be saying, we've just done a very good job. We pat ourselves on the back for having very low leakage numbers. But actually looking at the shape, we can see there's a problem with what's happening with the metering. Moving down, 1-star tend to be our frankly awful DMAs. So you can see there's clearly a data problem there, something's not right at all. And then finally our 0 stars are where we haven't got enough data to create a model. So there might be key things missing in that area. And we also use that so we use the paradigm rating to understand our confidence in the model. And then we use the same analysis to then map across to weekly categorization. So that allows us to say what kind of problems we think might be in a DMA. So our 5-star area is going to maintain, which is where we're saying there isn't a problem here. This is where we want our DMA to be. That's where all our DMA should sit on a weekly basis in a perfect world. Our 4 stars go into a leakage category. 2s and 3s go into integrity. So they're saying there's something wrong with the DMA's integrity or demand in the area. And the 1 0 stars go into data. So on a weekly basis, we've got this idea of the stars which tell us how the DMA is performing in the longer term. And then we have these work streams that give us a categorization on a weekly basis. So a 5-star DMA that suddenly has a leakage outbreak would move into a leakage work stream. That would tell analysts, you need to look at this from a leakage perspective. If it moves into an integrity work stream, we'd then be saying, something's not right here. We don't think it's a leakage problem. We think something else has gone on. Let's have a look and see what we can find. Okay, so starting to work through some case study examples. So this is a case study from Thames Water. So in this case study, we identified that there was a customer meter which wasn't previously being billed, which then became a continuous log user. There's a revenue benefit here of 39k a year, which I should put a disclaimer around. It is calculated as that the benefit came from finding the customer and tidying it up, but they were being logged. It was a kind of a migration issue between 2 billing systems that they kind of been dropped off the system. But effectively, we have the blue profile there, which is our net flow, and the orange, which is our model profile. And we've got that unaccounted for water shape at the bottom. So we can see we've got quite an erratic unaccounted for water shape, which tells us we haven't got a leakage problem with DMA. We think it's something else. It could be a problem with the boundary. It could be a problem with metering and logging. But in this case, we've got a much lower unaccounted for water at the weekend than during the day, which suggests an industrial user. So because we've got that drop in demand and drop in unaccounted for water at the weekend, that suggests that actually somebody's stopping what they're doing. They're not working at the weekend, and they come back on a Monday morning and does a lot more. One of the Thames Water analysts reviewed the customer, reviewed the DMA, and identified there was a customer which had 3 meters on GIS, but only one of those existing meters was logged. So they went out and did an investigation, put an extra logger on, and you can see that temporary customer logging perfectly matches, or almost perfectly matches, our unaccounted for water in that DMA. So there's having that view of what the unaccounted for water helps us to understand what possible cause would be. And in this case, we've gone out and found a customer that matches that cause. So we're confident that that's going to resolve the problem. Including that in the data and in the model significantly reduces the unaccounted for water in that area. So we've got a huge reduction in terms of the challenge that we're looking for. And if we hadn't done that shape analysis, we could have been looking at total volumes in that area and trying to understand maybe if there was a leakage problem. So in summary, the analysts added the DMA integrity workstream in Paradigm, and they confirmed it and did a customer survey, did some logging. There's an additional bill demand identified, and then there's an additional benefit there that comes through as a revenue benefit, but also comes through as a leakage targeting benefit because we've now got confidence in that area. This case is an Anglian Water one. So this is looking at how a network had been altered following a burst repair. So this investigation helped Anglian Water to identify that there was a breach between 2 DMAs rather than doing some leakage investigation. So you can see here, we've got a profile on the left-hand side as we come through September last year. And the profile is a very good match for the model. It's a little bit high maybe, but you can see we've got liters per second there on the axis, so maybe half a litre per second at night, but generally quite a good match. We then see on the 26th of September quite a significant step up in the profile. Now the key thing here is that the range of the profile has changed significantly as well. So we have had an increase in nightline. The increase in nightline has probably gone from sitting around kind of 0.5 up to maybe 0.7, 0.8, maybe even getting up to 1 litre per second at night. And that would be enough to trigger a leakage investigation into this area, it would have reached a threshold where actually, you know what, we've got an increase overnight, we need to go and do something. But because Paradigm can see, and the analyst can see, that the range of the shape has changed considerably. So whilst we've got a small increase in night flow, we've got a much bigger increase in daytime. That suggests that something else is going on, that actually this is a demand or network-related problem, not a leakage problem. So Paradigm placed the DMA into the integrity workstream to be investigated. So again, we can see that the unaccounted for water shape there of the longer term, we're getting that demand shape, which tells us we don't think it's a leakage problem. They did some investigations. They spoke to the network team. It turns out the network team had been out all night. They'd had a burst in a neighbouring area. They'd raised a job. They'd opened a boundary valve to backfeed that area while they were doing the burst repair to allow water to be supplied to customers. The job was still ongoing, but because the job hadn't been closed as part of their night's work, because it was still ongoing, it then hadn't fed through to the leakage team. So they didn't have the visibility coming in on the day of what's happening on that job yet. The valve then gets closed and brings the net flow back down in line with the model expectations. So the analysts are then able to say, well, this looks good, this makes sense. So in summary, we've got Paradigm saying this is an integrity problem, this isn't a leakage problem. The analyst confirms this and speaks to their team. They discover there was a boundary valve being opened. The network team then closed that valve. And the benefit here isn't a leakage benefit, but it is a leakage targeting. So we've prevented having to go out and do a leakage investigation. We've saved whatever effort we would have spent going out and doing investigations in that area, which would have wasted time. So we're able to direct that resource to somewhere else where they can be more effective. Looking at this next example, so this is working with the United Utilities. So you can see here we've got a DMA where the profile sits a bit below, but we're getting a much better fit during the day than we are at night. The Paradigm placed this into the integrity and workstream again and suggested, well, there's one of two things maybe happening here. Either the meter's not picking up the flow correctly, and this is a problem that we do tend to see with meters where they're oversized, or there's a problem with the meter, that it tends to fail more at lower flows than it does at the higher flows. So it could still be picking up higher flows quite accurately. Or it might be that we've got a boundary valve open. So because we've got pressure variation in the area, at night time, when the pressure is a bit higher, it might be pushing through from a different area. So we might have a boundary valve that's only really open, that only really affects the DMA at night time. They did a couple of things. The first thing they did was a pressure zero test to identify whether the area is breached. We didn't find anything. So pressure zero test is where we drop the pressure in an area, and if we've got a valve that's open, we should see water coming in from that direction, which should then sustain the pressure. So if we're unable to drop the pressure in an area, that tells us there's a secondary source of water. A flow of 10 meters cubed per hour was simulated in the DMA. So we're looking at liters per second. So that's about 3.5 liters per second. So we simulated a flow of 3.5 liters per second, but on the meter, we saw a spike that was 5 liters per second. And this got me scratching my head for a little bit to try and work out where the extra water had come from. And this is what we came up with. So the actual flow through the meter at night, on the left-hand side showed us that dotted line, was being under-recorded. So actually the meter wasn't picking up those lower flows, so we were getting a lower value. When we then flush 3.5 liters per second through the meter, we then see that increase in flow. But because that moves the meter up into an area where it's recording more accurately, it then also picks up the 1.5. So in this example, we've got 1.5 that's been under-recorded. We add on the 3.5, which is coming from the flushing, which gives us a total of 5, but then the meter picks up the full 5. So we then see that significant increase. Got out and got that corrected, and we can see there we've got quite a significant improvement in nighttime recording, and we're getting a much better fit across the whole DMA. So in summary, Paradigm says, we think we've got an integrity problem. The PZT, pressure zero test, where we dropped the pressure, confirmed that the boundary was tight, and they did a flow test at the same time that confirmed that the meter flow wasn't right. the meter error is resolved, and then we've got a benefit of +1 accuracy of DMA, which unfortunately isn't a nice tangible thing to measure. And as I'm sure you can see from the graph, increasing night flows into DMAs doesn't do anyone any favors from leakage reporting. But it does mean that as things start to change in that DMA, we've got that confidence of what's happening and what's going on. My last case study, which is a Thames Water one, which is actually a leakage one. So in this case, Paradigm identified that the DMA was leakage. So you can see here, we've got a profile there, a blue profile, which sits above the orange profile, which is Paradigm Model 1, which fairly consistently sits about 8 litres per second in there. The Paradigm says, we think there's leakage in this DMA. The client, this was when we started implementing Paradigm, so admittedly, the client already knew about these leaks. So what they went out and did was isolated the customer side leaks. So we had 4 customer side leaks. And they went out and turned the stopcock so we could check and see how much flow they were using at the same time. And you can see there, the flow from those customer leaks then drops down to the Paradigm expected profile. That gave us confidence that they're the leaks that they were looking for. They went out and repaired them. So you can see there, we've got a number of repairs going in place. But it doesn't bring us down to how far we were expecting to go. So actually, there's a bit of a gap there that says that, you know, one of these leaks hasn't been repaired, and that's quite useful when we're talking to external stakeholders. So particularly, I think in this case, they were council properties, and the council was saying, yes, we've done all the repairs, and we were able to go back and say, well, actually, no, we tested this, and we know that if you had repaired them, we would have dropped a full 4 litres per second off the profile, whereas it only looks like we've got 3 coming off the profile. So can you just double check and make sure those leaks have been done? And we could go out and go back to the same properties and recheck to make sure it's been done. So useful as a quality assurance piece there. So Paradigm added the DMA to leakage work stream. Analyst confirms this work stream and says, let's do some leakage work. Technicians had already located and quantified this burst. The repairs were implemented partially, and there's still a bit outstanding on that. But the leakage was identified and then targeted. So just to move on to some of the lessons learned from Paradigm and what we've done. So we've built a tool around this. So the key aim at the start was to say, we've got a spreadsheet. It needs somebody to kind of feed data into it. It's slow, it's cumbersome. So how can we automate this and give this to frontline analysts? So we've got a user interface now. That's a browser portal that people can log into. They can see the graph, they can understand what's happening, and we update that on a regular basis so they can see emerging issues. So that's been done, and I think some of the challenges around that are how do we keep that simple? Because whenever we develop new tools, and particularly in the world of leakage, there's always lots of pieces of data and lots of additional pieces of information we could be putting in there. But we've got quite a kind of a specific challenge here to improve targeting. But what we've learned across the project fundamentally is that tool isn't enough. So actually, we're not planning on having an AI solution that does all the work. So actually, we need to make sure that the people who are doing this understand the system and they've got the knowledge and skills. So as part of that, we've built a Paradigm Academy, which is an online training tool, which takes people from this is what a DMA is, up to understanding what leakage is, understanding the demand elements of it. So when they're looking at those graphs and the model profile starts changing, they can understand, well, why is that changing? Is it because we're moving into a school holiday period? So actually school demand's changing. Are we going into Ramadan, in particular DMA? Is it university term time? So we're seeing an influx of students coming into an area that means the profile goes up, in particular DMA. So how do we get that knowledge right? And how do we create that kind of center where new people coming into role can pick up that knowledge and can hit the ground running with what we're doing? And then also the third part of it is looking at process. So how can we streamline our processes and make sure Paradigm sits easily within business as usual? So how can we make it part of people's day-to-day roles and make sure that it's integral to what they do and that it sits nicely alongside other systems. So making sure we're not duplicating what they're doing, which is quite challenging across 7 different water companies when everyone's got their own process. And we've just come to the end of the second year of the 3-year club project. So we've got a new part of process, which is our workbook, which allows analysts to raise activities against individual DMAs for these kind of investigation jobs, which we're rolling out over the next month. To try to piece that in amongst other people's processes is interesting, and there's been a lot of lessons learned from that. And that kind of leads me on to the final piece that's been a big learning for us around how do we do better business transformation. So when we're going in and working with companies and making changes to process and changes to the way that we investigate and we analyze, we've got to make sure that we engage with those people in the right way. We've got to make sure there's tangible benefit. So I showed case studies there, and we've got lots of similar case studies in the water companies that allow us to really tell a story around what we're trying to do and what we're trying to share, to make sure there's an obvious case that people can relate to that says, well, yes, this is how it's going to make my life easier. And then we've also learned bits around making sure we're building champions within each organisation. How do we make sure we've kept things as simple as possible, but that there's people who really understand, that really get the detail and understand why some of the things are important and why we're pushing things on. So I think I talked there about the importance of a balanced approach. I suppose some of the lessons that you might want to take away as you're viewing this from kind of what we've done with Paradigm. We've created demand profiles over the past 2 years, and they are increasingly complicated. Because we're trying to do that kind of automated decision making around, do we think it's an integrity problem or a leakage, our profiles and our processes got increasingly more complicated. But actually, as a concept, this is relatively easy to do. If you've got a DMA, if you've got an area that you've got confidence in, and you think, well, yeah, you know what, this one matches well, this one's generally a good fit, then you can take that, and if it's got 1,000 properties, you can divide it by 1,000, and you can use that as a template. You could then say, I've got another DMA here that's got 1,500 properties. Let's put that in a spreadsheet with it. Let's multiply it up by the number of properties, and that gives you a good starting point just to look at what the shape looks like. I think most leakage practitioners have ideas of what minimum night flow should look like and what ratios in DMA should look like. But having actually a shape to go from helps us to spot things that I don't think we would normally spot looking at those profiles. So that's I think a useful tip and a useful thing so if you've got new practitioners coming in who are still learning, to be able to look at that comparison. But as we saw with the example earlier, often occupancy and other factors can make a big difference, and we can have extremes in terms of customer demand, and particularly where we've got industrial areas that are doing very odd things, it can be quite challenging to model those, which is why our models are getting more complicated. It also makes it a lot easier to communicate what you think the issue is and improve stakeholder engagement. So while we're working with analysts within the water companies and targeting teams, they're finding a huge benefit from them talking to their stakeholders, so the actual on-site teams, to say, well, this is why we don't think there's a leakage problem in this DMA. This is why I'm asking you to go and check boundary valves, or this is why we want to go and have a look at this customer, because we're looking for a customer that's got this shape, that does this, that adjusts the DMA in this way. So it gives that conversation some real kind of impetus, and also makes it easy to see what you're looking for. And then once you've found what you're looking for, you can put it back into the calculation and you can say, well, this has made the difference. We've closed that valve and that's changed the shape, and it's changed it to what we wanted it to be. So you can validate that those changes are there. That's it from me. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into what we've been doing, but I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Stuart. That's been an absolute wonderful introduction. Again, you've explained it very simply. It's great to see the work that kind of small companies doing in trying to kind of help us understand leakage and help us understand demand on there. So please, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. We've got the first question from Ian, and he was interested in the DMA that had a breach and wanted to know if the DMA next door, whether you saw a change in flow in that DMA as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so the system is running across all the DMAs, so you could see the comparable increase and change in there. Yeah.
Okay.
And
brilliant.
What we have done offline is I talked about kind of at the start about creating that kind of merged DMA kind of comparison, so you can sum the profiles together and see that it gives a good fit, which gives you confidence that that's then the cause of the problem, and that's then what's going on.
Okay, excellent. You also spoke about that it's not AI, you're using analysts. What role has machine learning though played? Has there been any role for machine learning in this, in trying to understand profiles and similar DMAs, or not?
Yeah, so we've so there's a few different stories. I mean, part of what we're doing on the non-household demand is more complicated, and particularly where we've got logged users, and we lose that logger from the calculation. So typically in the UK, water companies will log industrial users that have a high demand, but also can be quite erratic and make the profile quite difficult to understand. So they're effectively taking that flow away. So if you lose that data from the calculation, it can make it a lot more complicated. So the team worked quite hard on some machine learning approaches that allow us to forecast missing customer usage through those gaps. So that is quite complicated and quite hard to do. But other areas where I think there's a challenge really about how we take it forward is stuff around the household profiles. So if we've got household demand for an area, and we can see that the area is always performing slightly differently, we've got the option to use machine learning to learn that new behaviour and change the profile going forward. But that gets us into the same challenge that I talked about earlier, that are we normalizing a fault and a data gremlin that's sat in the system? Are we actually just accepting something that there might be a time offset on a logger or a slight breach somewhere or something odd that's happening? And the challenge really is, how much do we use AI and machine learning to improve the profile so they match, or how much do we use it to say, you know what, I don't believe this, let's go back to the fundamentals, let's go back to the basics and check everything about this area. And if we're sure that actually there's a different type of customer or a different type of usage, can we bring that whole circle, put that back into our learning, change the underlying kind of profiles that we're using?
Okay.
So not sure what the answers are on that one.
Okay, and to kind of build on what you said on there and what you said right at the start about if you are an analyst or you're a technician and you start looking after a certain number of DMAs, you kind of believe the profiles that you've got, that you've historically got, that you've done, and obviously your challenge is to try to find any long-term errors in that, isn't it? And so demographics is quite important, understanding how a semi-detached with 4 people in an affluent area works and everything like that. Are those patterns, are they repeatable? So if I took a property in Manchester with 4 people in an affluent area, would they use a similar amount of water in a similar way to maybe a similar house in Birmingham or a similar house in Norwich? Is that likely to be the same, or is there a fair fluctuation?
Yeah, so we are finding that the profiles are very similar. So we do have differences in weather in the UK, in terms of that we might have a very wet summer in the northwest, and it might be very dry over in the east of the country. But in terms of standard profiles and standard consumptions, yes, a 3-bed semi-detached property in the northwest will behave very similarly to stuff over in the east and down in the south. The changes tend to be more around when we get into those hot demand kind of periods, where you're seeing that an area that maybe has very chalky or sandy soil, so you've got a lot of water movement going through, so their gardens will dry out a lot faster and it might be a lot hotter, as opposed to an area like the northwest where I live, where it's clay and it rains all the time. So even at the height of summer, my garden is never dry. because the water just sits in the ground. So I very rarely tap on to water my garden. But other parts of the country will do things differently. So the base model is very similar. One of our next steps really is to understand some of these things around the soils and how those factors kind of affect how people are using water. Because we do have a challenge in the UK of summer demand kind of goes up, and trying to separate that from leakage. Those questions.
Okay, brilliant. We're not going to hold you too much longer, but if anyone's got any further questions they want to put in the chat, please do. I just want to ask you a little bit about smart meters, Stuart. So going forward in the UK over the next AMP period, over the next 5 years, there's going to be about 9.5 million smart meters put in based on what companies have told Ofwat. How do you think that's going to change paradigm? I assume it's going to improve it and make it a bit more precise. What are your thoughts about smart metering and helping us find leaks in DMAs and helping us validate whether DMA night flows are true or not?
So yes, I think there's a perception that at some point in the future we will move to fully smart metered, and we will then just be able to do a mass balance on DMAs. We'll just be able to pick total flow going in, and we'll be able to subtract all the customer usage, and that will tell us exactly how much water is passing in that DMA. And we'll have hourly profiles for all the customers, so we'll be able to do that as a shape and understand. What we're seeing from the data from the water companies that have already quite far along this journey is that things tend not to add up. So there's challenges around whether we're seeing under recording at meter level, at the individual customer meter level, that kind of opens that gap, might result in this recording and kind of saying that there's higher levels of leakage than there is. We also see the same kind of shape kind of understanding that we were looking at a paradigm. So what does the shape of this tell us about whether there's unaccounted for water in an area and what things look like? So there's, I think we will be able to use that data to understand the customer profiles more, but we're expecting that paradigm will help us to validate some of that data as well coming in, understand where we've got anomalies within customer profiles, but then also where the DMAs maybe are, we still have the same DMA problems where things are maybe being breached or there's other challenges.
Okay, so we'll have more data, which is absolutely brilliant, but your point is you've still got to validate that, you've still got to prove that that's giving you the true answer on there. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. More data may not all agree. So, okay, that's really interesting on there. Okay, thank you for everybody who's come and joined us on our webinar today. Thank you, Stuart, for that wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed it. Some really good knowledge there. And I wish when I'd come and joined the leakage team 20 years ago, I'd had something like this to start me off, because this is a really insightful work that you're doing on there. So thank you for your time, Stuart. Thank you for everybody else. And I'm sure we'll see you soon at another webinar. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Stuart, could you just stop the recording for us, if that's okay?